All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am Jenny Syed. I work for Cerner. I'm principal engineer there. Today I'm going to talk about subscriptions. One thing I'm going to ask you to do on this one is hold your questions till the end. I will have time to answer questions, at least I should. And subscriptions has a long and changing process, so some of the questions may get answered as we go through the story here. So as I'm kind of hinting at, subscriptions has kind of evolved over time. And specifically, very recently, it's changed a little bit more. So I want to give some of the background of what's been going on, why it's changing, and some of the challenges we still have. So before there was FHIR, PubSub has existed, right? It's been around in many different forms on the internet, from RSS services and Atom and other things. And so there's some general concepts that if you're familiar with PubSub, you're probably familiar with. And if not, we can do a quick review. So in PubSub, there's generally a publisher that categorizes messages into groups and classifications, right? And then it's going to send messages out. And obviously, there's somebody that's getting those messages, which is the receiver, who generally can say, I care about these categorizations, please send me updates. What's interesting about this, and something that's really kind of key to the way PubSub works, is that the publisher and receivers aren't one-to-one relationships, right? Receivers don't know all the publishers necessarily. They just know they're going to get notified. And publishers don't know about all the receivers. There's an indirection there, and it lets you scale and do a lot of different things behind the scenes that you don't have to know about. When we talk about that grouping into the different classifications, in FHIR, a lot of times that's called a topic. Or in FHIR, geez. In PubSub, that's called a topic. And you've seen these, right? I subscribe to XKCD. I may subscribe to articles about FHIR. And I, in FHIR, would subscribe possibly to modifications to a patient's demographics. And then the subscription itself actually represents that stream of messages for that topic. And then some PubSub systems in the wild have a concept of filters, so that you can say, well, I want all the articles from the New York Times, but only if it actually pertains to this, right? That's a filter. And what's interesting is that that filter, most of the time, in order to scale, is applied at an intermediary, so that the publisher just knows I'm sending you all the articles and letting you know when things happen, but then something in there that's sending the messages out knows how to filter it down to for a specific subscriber. All right, so with that kind of understanding, this is what subscriptions in FHIR looks like in R4. I'm not going to go through everything in it, just a couple of key points. Whoops, I'm going to fast forward a little bit, apparently. Animations. All right, so the status field on here is pretty key, in that you can see there's a requested, active, and there's error, which we're going to talk a little bit about, and off. The criteria is what you want to be subscribed to. It's what you want pushed to you. And we'll talk about some examples on that. And then there's this channel concept, which is pretty core. It would be kind of useless without it, which describes how you are getting notified or what type of system you are. And it allows for REST hooks, which means that the server is going to call and post things, kind of assuming you're a FHIR server-like thing. It'll post new resources to you. WebSockets, which is kind of important when you're trying to subscribe, especially with a personal device. You get that kind of connected stream of messages. You can also do email and SMS, and then the message side of FHIR, right, instead of the REST side of FHIR. That endpoint is where that channel is pointing to, so where do you want to get notified? For a REST hook, it's that URL. For an email, it's going to be the email address. SMS, similarly, it's going to be the SMS that gets called. The payload's kind of interesting. You can see there that it says you can omit it for no payload. We'll talk about why you might want to do that, but otherwise you'd probably say I want FHIR JSON, for example, or FHIR XML as the payload, or for email and SMS, it's probably text. And this header, which is kind of sneaky in that a lot of people didn't realize what this was for until we started getting into some of the connectathons. So I promise I'll come back to this, by the way. So criteria examples. So on this one, your criteria is pretty much any valid query in FHIR today, right? So if you can search on it, you can subscribe to it. So I want all observations for this patient. Anytime you get a new one, it changes, I want to know about it. I want to know about any changes to the patient's demographics and basic profile. Their primary care physicians are also on the patient resource. So you would get notified for changes for that. And then you can start getting more specific. I want to know about a specific observation and if it ever changes, and that, for example, all of the vital sign of blood pressure. Like you could subscribe to that. You could actually subscribe as well to the category of vital signs if you wanted to for a specific patient. And then you can start getting kind of scary, depending on what kind of FHIR survey you are. I just want to know about everybody that has any changes to any food allergy, every single person in the system, right? That's what this one is. Oh yeah, chaining, also totally allowed, right? So I want to know about every patient that has a specific type of observation or diagnosis. It starts to get really complex. So there's some implications to that. So that's kind of the super high level overview of what subscriptions is. I do want to be very specific of what subscriptions is not. So it's not CDS hooks. It's not a replacement for CDS hooks. CDS hooks, the way it's driven today, it assumes that there is a user there, and it's going to reach out, the user's doing something, it's going to ask you if you need to give them information to make a clinical decision real time. Subscriptions, there is no guaranteed active user. There's nothing to call back to or to send a message back to. So think of subscriptions as more of the like system-to-system B2B type notification. There's not necessarily a user triggering that thing. The trigger of the update can come from anything in the system, both user actions, system actions, interfaces coming in, all of that kind of stuff. And it's not FHIRcast. For those of you that aren't familiar with FHIRcast, FHIRcast is specifically kind of a new technology, better replacement for CCAL. So a lot of it is keeping a session in sync between two devices, two applications, so that if I change the patient on this application, the patient on this application switches to and they stay in sync, okay? That's not, subscriptions is not meant to that. Again, there's not necessarily an active user involved at all in a subscription. That doesn't mean that you aren't notifying somebody on your device because of a subscription, but that's not the primary driver of the notification. All right, so that's pretty similar. What you see in R4, it's been around with minor tweaks since subscription was a draft resource in FHIR. And then we've had a lot of connectathons. So the first one was in September 2017, and Isaac Vetter from Epic was the lead on these. And if you look at those old connectathons, a lot of times they were targeting in on this event definition extension. And if you're wondering why it was targeting in on that, is that there was this distinction between systems that do eventing, like you think of with V2, like ADT messages, admit, discharge, transfer, versus that criteria thing that we just looked at. And sometimes it's easier to describe it in an event way, and sometimes it's easier to describe it as a criteria. And so they kind of focused on that. And if you read the use cases that were given, it's the beginnings of FHIRcast. And then January 2018, it even specifically calls out the newer FHIRcast standard during the subscriptions track. And while there was general connectathon efforts looking at subscriptions during that time, it was also focusing in on this. And then even in May 2018, if you look, there isn't a separate subscriptions track. It was just FHIRcast at that point, even though the people that went to the FHIRcast track were also playing with subscriptions. So it kind of switched. So now that that was born, Isaac had to go actually do FHIRcast. And so he started running that track, and I took over for subscriptions so that we could still work on some of the general non-FHIRcast side of things, now that we decided that subscriptions wasn't the best place for that. So the connectathons of September 2018 through May 2019, we really focused a lot on more general use. We looked at how the spec was described and how it could be used and where the weaknesses were. We didn't look at the extension as much anymore because we were trying to drill on what can be done with the current subscription and where were its weaknesses. I would say that most of the focus throughout those subscriptions was still on the REST hook aspect. However, especially in the last probably 2 connectathons, we got WebSockets working, and we got a lot of feedback about that as well, which was nice. And even some of the email notifications, we started playing with that as well. And there were definitely things that happened that we learned from these. Some of the things that we learned as we went through this that kind of surprised the people that were in there on the connectathons is the way errors work. So you, as a requester of a subscription, you post the new subscription out to the FHIR server, and you put it in a requested status. And the FHIR server will either put it into active if it decides to accept it, or it'll put it into offer error if it says, I'm not going to do this, or something's wrong, right? In addition, if something happens, so let's say that the publisher tries to contact that REST hook you've registered, and it can't. It keeps getting errors, it's not getting responses. Eventually, at some point, it's going to flip the status of the subscription into error, and it assumes that you as a subscriber will check it every once in a while to make sure things are going on and working. And then after some undefined period of time, I can turn it off as the FHIR server. I can say, okay, you obviously don't care there's an error, this isn't working anymore, maybe your company's gone under, or your cloud has been down forever, so I'm gonna shut this off. And then you have to come back in and re-request a subscription once you know how to resolve it. There's a lot of ambiguity in the spec still, and we found this especially when we started looking into emails. When we trialed it out at the last Connectathon, I think we got it from Graham's server, I think Carevolution did one, I know there was at least one other one, and all of them sent emails completely differently. I think Carevolution sent you a really pretty HTML email, so it assumes the end user is a person that gets that alert. And so it assumes you want to see text about, for example, if you're a patient, that you just got new labs, right? That seems pretty reasonable. I think Graham's server sent out an email with an attachment of the raw FHIR data, and that was pretty much all you got. And then I think there was one other server that just went and spewed all the raw FHIR data into the email, because that's totally readable, right? Similarly, for text, for SMS, it doesn't talk about what's actually in that message, right? You can assume that trying to put the entire FHIR resource in an SMS message is probably a bad idea, right? But it doesn't call that stuff out. And when we talked to Graham about some of these differences, he called out that the reason his server did what it did is he's kind of assuming that there's an intermediary. It's the system that you're emailing or texting, and it's going to do some processing and then decide who else needs to know about this and what formats. Whereas, obviously, the Carevolution server assumed it was a real person, right? And that's definitely still ambiguous. We've logged some trackers to fix a lot of this stuff in the specification to make it more clear and to see what we can do in the specification. Another one that came up are security questions, and it's actually from both sides. The FHIR server is like, what kind of security should I have? And a lot of times the answer is, well, it's smart. We're going to use smart security in order for you to create a subscription. But it's a little more complicated than that, which we'll get into. But then also the receivers, right? If you're going to send me clinical data, I better make sure that you're the person I think you are, especially if you're sending me the clinical data that I'm going to make a decision upon. Or I want to make sure that you're not trying to denial of service me by just sending me a bunch of pings constantly over and over again. I want to be able to fail that fast and kick it out of my system because you're not authorized. And so we were like, well, that's interesting. How do you do security for the receiver side, for subscriptions? There's nothing in the specification. Surprise, surprise, there is. It's not obvious, though. You have to dig into examples to see it. So there's that header field we talked about. That's where the security goes. In an example, which is really the only place it was mentioned in the specification, you as a subscriber can send me an authorization header that I then have to send back to you when I notify you, right? Which is interesting. But from a FHIR server perspective, that kind of was a wake-up moment, because I don't think of subscription as something that I need to put a lot of protection around. It's non-clinical data, but all of a sudden I have secrets, which is extra scary in that it's not even something I would put in my clinical system unencrypted, right? So now I have this special field that I have to consider as a FHIR server. What do I do with it? I can't just store it in raw. That would be bad, right? These are authentication tokens. I would get in big trouble. And then another thing, an aspect of security that a lot of servers were concerned about is, I'm just kind of throwing messages to these people that have subscribed to me. Bad things happen. People get compromised. And this is an automated system that's just going constantly, sending clinical data out. What do I do to protect that data if I'm worried that the other side may get compromised? And so that's where that payload field comes into play, and that even you as an app can try to say that you want a payload, but I as a FHIR server may say, nope, I'm just going to ping you because I don't want to send the clinical data. And there's other reasons for that as well. So remember how we talked about that separation between publisher and receiver? There's nothing in the FHIR spec that says you have to tell me who you're going to show this notification to, which means in my system, for example, different physicians and user types can see different things. And in order for me to send safe alerts that don't compromise patient's privacy, I have to be able to run all the security checks before I notify you. But I can't because I don't have the information I need to do that. And so in those cases, what will likely happen is that I as a server will send you a ping to tell you that there's more information, rerun your query, and then you will rerun the query in the proper context. And you might get some false positives because the person that's actually going to read the data may not have the privileges to see that data. But I won't have compromised anything, assuming I don't let you subscribe to something very specific, like new positive HIV result. So, and then another one that is interesting, especially once you throw this authorization secret in there, is who can read, update, and delete subscriptions. It's not something that everybody could do, because all of a sudden I just killed your subscription in the clinical system. That'd be bad. Or I just saw your authorization secret. That's a little scary, right? So there's implications here that are definitely outside of the specification. They're not specifically called out. We actually logged trackers, again, for the security side in the last Connectathon to have a lot of this clarified. But now there's some open issues. And these are a lot more complicated, given what subscription is today. What if that criteria is sent and it's not acceptable? Like, what do you do? What if you try to subscribe to something that I don't want to send notifications on? Especially if it's like all of everything in the system for every single patient. What happens when the data falls out of the data set? So the way that those criteria work is if something would show up or change in that query, the assumption is that you will get a notification. What if somebody deletes something? It's not going to show up in the query. What if somebody modifies it and your subscription is to all temperatures over 104 degrees and the nurse fat fingered it and she changes it and now it's 102? It's not in that query anymore. Those are kind of the easy ones. The harder one is security. What if you had privileges or didn't have privileges to see data that is in that set and it changes? That's not one that even the server is going to know necessarily that happened, right? But today, there's like no way to handle most of this, or it's very hard, unless like delete, some systems probably could do. Modification of falling out of the data set is a little bit harder, especially for a performant thing. And then a lot of people were asking, how in the heck is my server supposed to do this? And it came from two different directions. One was, I'm writing a reference server, and I have infinite criteria possibilities. How do I do this? How do I realistically do this? And another one is for event-based systems. They're like, this isn't how we think about subscriptions. Our system doesn't track just modifications of everything. It tracks that there was a patient that was admitted and a new order that was placed and an order that was modified and they got discharged, right? That's how our systems think about it sometimes. And then another thing that came up, especially in the last one, is that when you think of WebSockets without FHIR, you think of it as something that a lot of people can hit and get streams from, right? You don't think of it as like one for every single tiny app out there. You think of, hey, if a lot of people are in my browser app, they're all going to get a WebSocket. They'll get streaming updates. It'll be great. But the way the current spec is written, the thing that you attach the WebSocket to is the ID of the subscription. And so, for example, if somebody deletes the subscription, you should definitely wipe that WebSocket. But if you were doing it a different way and you had kind of a general WebSocket for observation updates, you should not delete that WebSocket behind the scenes, even if you were allowing it to be kind of fronted by the ID. So you have to be really careful about that. And it's kind of a different way than what most people are used to thinking about how WebSockets work. And so this was another kind of awkward thing that we discovered during that. So a lot of this is interesting because a lot of these big issues come from the drift between what we think of as pub sub outside of FHIR and how FHIR had implemented it. So some of the big issues, the publisher or the FHIR server has no way to define the set of topics, right? As far as FHIR was concerned, you could try to subscribe to whatever you wanted, and then maybe I would accept it, and maybe I wouldn't. But there wasn't a great way to figure out what I would do beforehand, except for reading documentation, maybe, which isn't good. So the receiver has no way to determine ahead of time what they can do, right? That's not good. FHIR, that's generally not a thing FHIR likes. We like conformance statements, and we like, or capability statements, and we like all of that programmatic discovery. And in the current stuff, there's no obvious way to describe to just an ADT, like traditional V2 type subscription and an admit discharge transfer. And again, this goes into systems that already do understand that really well, and it's not as easy to do in the current spec. And then for those reference servers that you can launch and bring up kind of generally for your own implementations, they really, in the current spec, are non-performant by default. If they have to accept infinite amounts of subscriptions to infinite amount of things, that's kind of a problem, right? They'd be releasing it and being like, well, try not to do bad things, please. But everybody's going to try to do whatever they want. And again, that goes back to the topic and filter are all defined on the receiver side. The server doesn't have any programmatic, well-defined control over it today. And then there's some smaller persistent issues. We talked about the error issues, like it's a little fuzzy. You may know that it errored out. You can't really tell what errored today if you're a client and you call back and you see your subscription's in error. That's really all the information you have is it's an error. Something happened, sorry. You don't know how many errors have occurred. It's a big difference between one thing failing and 100 things failing. Again, you don't know what error happened. You have no idea. You just know it was an error. So it's kind of hard to troubleshoot without picking up a phone and calling somebody. The payload is very all or nothing, which isn't great either. Like, wouldn't it be nice to know if you have subscribed to a lot of things, what thing had an update so that you kind of have a hint? So we did this. And at the last Connectathon, we had a lot of discussion, and we basically broke the glass and decided it was time to hit the big red scary button. So what do we do? A lot of breakouts with a lot of people from the Connectathon involved, many different vendor systems, many different reference servers, decided to sit down. And if you're curious about the notes, the slides will be out. It's got the links in there, and you can read through a lot of discussion, what we talked about. I could have bit.ly or shrunk that for you, but I'm going to assume you get the slides. So, and then we decided there has to be kind of a new way to think about subscriptions. There were just a lot of gaps in the way we did it today that were causing problems. So topics and subscriptions, right? If you don't have something, this is going to be your situation, right? Hey, I can do everything. OK, I want to do this. Oh, sorry. I'm glad. You got to choose from this. This list that I'm not going to show you. So we created a proposed topic resource. And in that topic resource, there's a possible list of filters that can be applied for that topic as well. And that is all something that you as a server could determine that people can't just randomly create topics, but you can publish your topics so that they can look them up. And then the subscription now, which does still exist, instead of having that criteria, it links back to the topic that they are interested in subscribing to. And it lets them define the filters that they care about. So you said, here's the list of filters you can do, and they say, cool, here's the filter I'm going to apply. And it means that there's much closer alignment now with kind of that general pub-sub idea, right? And it's helping solve a lot of those big issues that at least we hope, that we have in there. So here's what topic looks like. This is from a super draft thing that Eric has put together, and I have links out there for those of you that are going to watch this branch. I just cut part of the resource instead of the whole thing for now. But essentially, the topic has the title and the URL, which I don't have in this specific chop of the resource, but I have some examples. And then it has the trigger, which you can see here, which has a lot of things, and the filter. So instead of looking through the definition, I was going to show an example here. So here's an example of a topic with an ID of admission, just for readability. It could be a number, but I'm going to call it admission. And then a URL in this case that's going to point back to an IG that had defined this, right? To say, hey, you cared about that Argonaut admission topic that was kind of defined in that implementation guide. Cool, this is the implementation of that. And then it has this resource trigger and this resource type. And this is a list. And this is what resource you're going to get back when this triggers, right? So if you go and you subscribe to admissions, you're not getting the patient back. You're getting the encounter that was admitted back. And then there's this query criteria section. And there's a couple different ways you can do it. As you can see, there's the previous, which for admission, the previous status is not in progress. And again, this is an example, so just keep that in mind. The query status is not in progress in the previous. The current status is in progress. And yes, both of these things have to be true before I get triggered, right? I don't want to know that something is in progress now, was in progress before. I don't want to get alerted on that. I only want to get alerted when it changed, right? And then there's this other thing, for those of you that really like FHIR path, you can also describe it with FHIR path instead of using those two separate parameters. So then we talked about the filters. So here's the can filter by. And in this case, I can filter by a patient, a practitioner. So if I want to know all of Dr. Bob's patients that are admitted, and birth date as well on the patient for this one. And I think we were trying to get some different examples. And then the subscription resource has changed. And a lot of it is very, very similar to what was there. So we still have the status. We now have a topic instead of criteria, so it's going to link back to the topic you're subscribing to. You now have the filter by, and I will show an example of this so that you can, this is kind of interesting. One thing I do want to call out is that match type. So those of us that are familiar with FHIR's modifiers, where you can say equals, above, below on the actual query parameter, we didn't want to include that in the actual definition on the right-hand side of this. It got really complicated, so it's defined as its own field to say how you want to match that. And now we have this error concept. So not only can the status be in error, there is a string that can say at least what the last error was. So hey, error connection timeout. Hey, there's probably some firewall between us. I should probably figure that out, right? And how bad is the error? How many errors have occurred, right? And I, as a server, may not even set the status to error. You may see one error, and the server hasn't flipped it, because it's supposed to wait for an amount of time before it flips it to error. But you can actually watch this as a subscriber and see, you know, something's starting to happen. This error count is crawling up. I need to start troubleshooting now. And then we still have the channel. We still have the types, the endpoints, and the interesting header field that's sneaky security there. So those really haven't changed. But the payload has changed a little bit. It still has the content type in there, but in saying all or nothing, instead of having only all or nothing, right now we allow you to say, yeah, empty, I don't need anything, so that's just that ping, again, that lets you know to go requery. I can also send you only the IDs of the resources that have changed. So if you don't want to do a full search of the patient's record, now you might be able to just go read by ID, right? And then you can also get the full resource for those servers that would allow it. That's still an option. So an example, and this is a kind of cut down example. So again, there's a reference to that admission topic from the subscription. I'm going to filter by patient. I only care about admissions for this specific patient. Maybe it's my mom, right? Maybe I care if something happens to my mom. I want to get notified. Now I have an error. So this specific subscription has an error with a timeout contacting endpoint. Well, it's only happened once so far. Oh, I need to fix it. Like I said, these are super draft. And then in this one, the payload is content of ID only. Okay? All right, so that's great. We now have these super draft resources and some things we've tried to do. So where do we go from here? So for you all, what I would suggest is keep in touch. On Zulip, chat.fhir.org, there is a channel specifically about subscriptions. We have a lot of conversations about there. We want feedback out there. So definitely keep an eye on it. Please keep an eye on the Connectathon. The page hasn't changed yet for the next working group, but I guarantee there will be a subscriptions track at the next working group meeting. So keep an eye on the Connectathon's pages. For Argonaut, we are currently running a subscriptions track. And Josh Mandel and Eric Haas are essentially helping do that, helping do the draft resources, herding all the cats, as we like to say, to talk about this. Oh. Sorry. And one of the use cases that we are specifically looking at is that ADT use case, the admit, discharge, transfer. If you want to keep up with this is the GitHub link to where like issues get logged and stuff for Argonaut around the subscriptions. We have an Argonaut stream as well, though most of the talk should still go on the subscriptions stream. This is another stream to keep an eye on. And then you can always watch the branches. They are out there with the draft resources for topic and subscription. So Eric was able to get that out, I think, so that you can look at it. All right. See, I promised you I'd have time for questions. Go for it.
How many topics are there actually going to be available that you can subscribe to now?
Yep. So the question is, how many topics are going to be available to subscribe to? That will depend on the server. So my imagination here, since we're still in, like, I'm not sure how long ago those draft resources were published, but I know it's not very long ago. But that servers will limit it based on their use cases. Some of the reference servers will likely have other types of limitations they put in place to make sure that it's more performant. But I don't know that it's going to be like tiny. I would be scared if there was like 2 or 3 things, but my guess is there will be a well-defined set of topics that servers will do depending on their use cases. I can't tell you exactly how many because it's definitely going to depend on implementation.
Yeah, I was thinking about, before you could refine it down, like I want all observations from a certain patient.
Yeah, so you may have thought that you could do that. And that's the point. So that's the problem. Like previously, it looked like you could do anything you wanted, yeah. But in reality, that is not how it would have gone because servers literally wouldn't have been able to implement some of that. So, but that is the discussion. And definitely give feedback as you see topics that you're interested in. That would be something to keep watching. I agree. Observations is one that there's probably going to be something to watch that. I saw Isaac's hand up, and then he took it down.
I just wanted to ask, as part of that, couldn't a pure FHIR, quote-unquote, server or reference implementation allow clients to create a topic and then subscribe to it by defining like the FHIR path stuff?
Yep. So
wouldn't that be a potential scenario?
Yeah, so the question was, wouldn't some of the pure FHIR servers be able to allow a client to define a topic and then subscribe to it? And yes. I expect there to be. Though we've had feedback from some of those servers knowing that there's still going to be some type of limitation on that. We just don't know what it's going to be. Go ahead.
Yeah, so mine was related to that, which is there a distinction between representing topics and actually advertising that you support the topic?
So the question was, is there a difference between representing topics and advertising that you support them? It's an interesting question because technically if you have a resource that you expose read on, so topic, they can query the entire set, or you could at least enable that. Also, in the capability statement, you have the ability to reference profiles for specific resources. And so that's another place that if you support an implementation guide that defines 5 different topics, you could declare that support in your capability statement, at least where we're going so far. That's what I would expect. Go ahead.
Regarding overlapping subscriptions, some pub/sub implementations have a merge box or a way to check for duplications and so forth. Has any thought been or anything on that regard?
So the question was that some pub subsystems today have a way to detect that there's an overlap in the subscriptions you have. And basically avoid duplicate notifications and things like that. And if that was a consideration that we have talked about so far. And no, it's not one that we've talked about so far, but again, definitely participate in the Connect-a-thons and participate in the conversation. Go ahead. I might have to come up there because I can't hear. I'm going to walk off the stage, so they're going to be angry at me.
Getting notified about changes that are not variables. So for instance, if you query about a change in status or anything that's not used, it's easy. You can go from this to not this. What about a text, like for instance, a conclusion in a diagnostic report, where the text changes, you need to know about that.
Okay, so the question was, from the examples that we had up there, it's obvious that changes to specific fields like status you can get notified on, but how would you do something a little bit fuzzier? For example, the changes to a conclusion that's a text field or something like that. And this one's interesting because there's kind of two answers to this. One is that my guess is in FHIR there's a way to detect the change there as well, and that it's equal and not equal and things like that. But even without that, one of the interesting concepts here was that even if you can't fully describe something through a FHIR syntax the way we have it today, as long as there's an understanding in the FHIR server of what that means, they can still notify on it, which is interesting. So I think that that's a possible thing to describe. I would have to look at the syntax, but even if it wasn't, one of the things we've talked about is even though you see the admission thing up here described as a status changing to a specific thing to a specific thing, for example, in Cerner's system, we have V2 ADT feeds. We would probably trigger it off of the exact same criteria, and it would end up working.
So I think just to restate what you said, we have three ways of saying the same thing at FHIR path and a search criteria, but you can also just have a name, and that's your trigger.
Yeah.
Description.
So Eric was clarifying that while we showed like kind of the before, the after, and the FHIR path, it's the name. So I could have something called change to conclusion topic, and then you would kind of know what that meant through documentation. Go ahead.
You described primarily a system-to-system type interaction. I'm trying to wrap my head around the security. It's not really patient scope. It's not really user scope. Are we looking at system users? Or?
Yeah. So the question was, I didn't really talk about a real-time interactive user, and a lot of times in SMART we talk about the user scopes and the patient scopes. And so is this a system thing? And yes, it can be. There's nothing in the specification today that says that you can't create a subscription using a token that is with the signed-in user today. What it doesn't say is that that affects the subscription directly in any way. So a lot of the testing we've done so far has been using the system scopes. It's been the system-to-system aspect of the authentication from SMART. But I don't think that's necessarily a requirement. It's just that you're starting to walk into muddy waters as far as what you expect that to do, because the spec doesn't call out that just because Dr. Bob was signed in when the subscription was made, that the security behind the scenes will be assuming that Dr. Bob is the person getting the notifications. It's that fuzzy part of the specification right now. Other questions? All right. Oh, sneak it in at the last minute. I can't remember. Oh, sorry. The question was, is the FHIR path criteria meant to be in addition to the other criteria? And no, it's not. They're supposed to, if you filled out all those fields, they should all represent the same thing. It's just the FHIR path gives you the way to do it in a pretty powerful one-liner, whereas the criteria way gives you a way to say prior state, current state. FHIR path allows you to say that all in one place. Correct. The current and the previous are variables that would be in there. Other questions? Okay, for real this time. If you have other questions, feel free to come up and ask me. Otherwise, enjoy DevDays.